Well, hi again, folks. I'm here with another video, and here at work, believe it or not, in the parking lot. So, taking a little bit of a break to do this video for you guys because it's been on my mind. Oh, I should say, well, yeah, it's been on my mind not to do the video, but the information that I'm going to share right now has been in my mind for quite some time. I figured since I'm not in Madeira, where I would love to be right now, I might as well fill in the gap on the channel with just information that I've just been gathering over the past few months. Now, it's been exactly 1 year, well, not to the day, but exactly 1 year since we were in Madeira. This past Sunday, yeah, Sunday would have been the day that we actually came back from Madeira after about a week there, where we visited mainland Portugal, and then we skipped over to Madeira. And Madeira was really our point of destination, but we had to pass through mainland Portugal, so we spent 2 days in Lisbon, not consecutive, but a day and a day when we landed, and then a day and a half when we were heading back out, something like that. But here I am today with this video, and the video has more to do with the history of Portugal, Madeira, or something to do with the history of it. I'm not saying I'm going through some extensive entire history about the Iberian Peninsula, about Portugal, about Madeira, but something that's near and dear to me. Now, when I'm going to speak about this topic is going to be about the Jews of Portugal, or even the Iberian Peninsula. Now, right here, you guys might be like, or maybe you might look at the topic and you're going to be like, I'm not even going to watch this video. What is this guy talking about? He's a black guy, Jewish. What is he? Is he going to come in here with that Hebrew Israelite nonsense, talking about how black people are the true Jews and whatever? No. That's a whole different topic, and I have my issue with those people anyway. I have a bunch of videos on another channel that I have where I deal with them all the time. But why would I be interested in this? Now, if you looked at my first video I think I did with my wife, you may have noticed that I mentioned, or I was talking about, how Madeira came into our focus and why it became so interesting to us and why it was so important for us to travel there. And that is because my wife and I both have a part of our ancestry that comes from Madeira. And when I say a part, I just, of course, primarily our DNA shows that we are connected to Africa. But there's a portion which was always a mystery to us, at least for some time. Like, how did Portugal get into this, or how did Spain, in my case, get into this? And it's always been there in the back of our minds. We've always thought about it, and now by going to Madeira, we really felt that closeness to a place where both my wife and I, our great grandparents came from. And so we felt this immediate connection once we learned, and our DNA test confirmed the fact that, the oral history that was passed down to us confirmed the fact that, yes, we were connected to Portugal through ancestry. But now, when it comes to the Jews, you might wonder, why in the world would I even be interested in that? Well, let's see. Let's see where I should start. Let's go back a bit, leading up to something, because it's the oral history I started hearing first before I started confirming it with modern day technology like DNA and so forth. Now, the whole thing about me being connected to Portugal was something I learned later on in my life. I want to say within the past 10 years was when I first heard about that. Even though there was a comment that was made in passing when I was much younger, but it just flew over my head, just didn't make any sense to me at the time. And as I mentioned in that first video, was when my uncle, this is on my father's side, my father's brother, said in passing that my grandmother, his mother, who raised me on the island of St. Kitts, mentioned in passing, he said something one day he just said, "Hey, Mama," that's what we called my grandmother, his mother. He said, "Mama's people came from Portugal, you know." Or more or less the way he was basically saying is that her ancestry comes from Portugal. Now remember, we're in a small little tiny island known as St. Kitts. As far as I know, St. Kitts and Portugal never really had anything in common. You know, the Portuguese never colonized St. Kitts, so it was weird to me that he would mention that. But again, it flew past me. Even though I knew where Portugal was on a map, I didn't know as much about Portugal as I came to know as time moved on. But at the time, I knew at least where Portugal was, but didn't know anything more about the place. And it was just like, people come from Portugal, okay, you know, big deal. You know, it didn't really make much sense to me at the time. Obviously, within the past 10 years or so, now it has really come home to what that all means. But that's my father's side. Now, over on my mother's side, there's also a Portuguese connection, and also connected to Madeira, because her great-grandfather, or my great-great-grandfather, through her father, was also from Madeira. The surname, as far as I know, I believe was Costa. Okay? Think over in the Caribbean, we say Da Costa, but the surname was actually Costa. Now, in researching that side, on my mother's side, I was fortunate to be directed to a first cousin of my mother's father. So a first cousin of my grandfather. At the time I reached out to him, he was in his 90s. He did not know me. I did not know him. We did not know each other. Okay? Because even though he was my grandfather's first cousin, and I wasn't close to my grandfather either, because my mother wasn't really close to him. But this first cousin, he went off into the big world. He was in World War II. He was in the Korean War. He was in the Vietnam War. Well-decorated man. Of course, I didn't know anything about him at all. But he went off into the big world to do his own thing. The only reason I got to know this man was because when I started to ask my mother and said, "Mom, I don't know anything about your father. I don't know anything about his background. What's going on?" That's when my mother directed me to other family members, some of her cousins, who then eventually directed me to that man who now was in his 90s. The reason why they directed me to him was because he was a grandson of our family patriarch who came from Madeira, Mr. Da Costa. He grew up with him. So he was the one person that I could reach out to find out about this Portuguese ancestor, because no one else really knew anything about him. You know, apparently he lived his life, had his children, and being that he had moved to the island of Nevis, that's where my mother's from, because he had moved to the island of Nevis, he immigrated from Madeira to the island of Nevis. Because he had moved there at a relatively young age, I guess he became so assimilated, he never really discussed much about his life back in Madeira, and he never went back to Madeira, so I guess it was all kind of like lost. But because this gentleman that I'm speaking about now, my grandfather's first cousin, because he grew up with him, he was the key, he was the window to giving me some information about this gentleman. So in talking to him one day, there was a picture circulating, because as I started giving out information, more and more people started coming forward with information. So there happened to be a picture that was circulating. And the picture that was circulating on the internet, well, through our family, you know, WhatsApp and so forth, was a picture of a man sitting in a chair with a priest's collar on. And they were saying that this was the family patriarch, Mr. Da Costa, from Madeira, Portugal. I thought that was a little curious. You know, I was like, okay, you know, Portugal is a primarily a Catholic country, so perhaps he was a minister, he was a priest, you know. But then when I asked this gentleman, the 90-year-old man, I said to him, I asked him, I said, "Do you remember your grandfather being a priest?" He says, "Not to my knowledge. He was not a priest." He said he was a Jewish man. I said, "A what?" He said, "A Jewish man." And I said, "Jewish, like Jewish?" He said, "Yes, he was a Jewish man, and he came from Portugal." And I guess he meant, you know, Madeira. And I said, "Well, how do you know this?" And he said, "Well, my grandmother, his wife, who was a local woman from the island of Nevis, who apparently followed more of a Christian path, he said that he used to joke with his wife, who used to try to invite him to come to church with her. And he would mock her or joke around with her like, why am I coming to your church? I am Jewish. And supposedly, this gentleman also told me he followed certain Jewish rituals. I don't know what the rituals were, or followed certain Jewish customs or whatever. I don't know what they were. So that was a surprise to me. Of course, the first surprise was my mother's family have any connection to do with Portugal. That was the first surprise. And the second surprise was the patriarch of our family was a man who was Jewish. So I was just like, wow. And how I know this to also be true, or to say confirm, that same gentleman that I'm speaking of, I got to know his nephews and his nieces. We all know one another now because, again, we're all here compiling all this information together. They said when they used to go to visit him, he used to take them to certain places that he knew Jewish people owned. And he would jokingly tell the owners of the establishment, hey, I'm here today. I should get a discount on that because you know I'm Jewish. And he was saying this jokingly because his own grandfather was a Jewish man from Madeira, Portugal. So now, I hope that explains that. Now, here's what's interesting. Now, that's oral history. Now, to confirm. So I did my DNA test, and when you do your DNA test, depending on where you are and depending on which test you take, like I took Ancestry. Ancestry doesn't say anything at the bottom like you're Jewish or of Jewish descent or anything along that line. But there's another website known as Genome Link, which I wish they would pay me for some advertisement here right now. Genome Link. And what they do, you can take your DNA file and you can provide it to them. And they go more than just showing you your DNA matches, which I don't think they do. But there's a part of their website where you can do the European side of your DNA. I don't know about the African side. That's another side I really want to look into, obviously, for obvious reasons. But the European side, I decided to drop my information in. What Genome Link does, it goes better than just showing you a general location you're from. Like when I go to Ancestry, it just says Portugal. Doesn't say anything specific. But Genome Link will go ahead and trace your DNA from the various locations that it has traveled, meaning your ancestry. When I looked up, I happened to notice that it shows Balkan Jews as a part of my heritage. So Jews in my heritage and my ancestry that settle in the Balkans somewhere. But from there, they moved over to northern Italy, which is not surprising because northern Italy had two of the most powerful cities in the medieval world, Genoa and Venice. But from those areas, you see the line. It shows you the line of travel. And it shows the line where they left from northern Italy and they moved over to the Iberian Peninsula. And they settled in the area of Seville, which is southwest Spain, but closer to the Portuguese border. And it shows where the family settled in that area along the Spanish-Portuguese border. Most of the family saturation was over on the Spanish side. And it spills over the border over into Portugal. Why is this interesting to me? Because when I first did Ancestry, it showed me that I had more DNA connection on the Portuguese side and a little bit on the Spanish side. Well, that has flipped around now as they have adjusted and updated. Now I have more on the Spanish side than I do the Portuguese side. But what is interesting is it's right along the Portuguese Spanish border. And why that is interesting, it's because right over there on the Portuguese side, there is two communities, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong about both, but there are two communities that I know of. One is called Monsanto, and I'm going to bring that up in a minute. One is called Monsanto, and the other one is called Belmonte. Now, Monsanto, as far as I know, and Belmonte also, These two areas were areas over in Portugal where crypto Jews created communities. And for those of you who may not know what a crypto Jew is, back in 1492, people know that as the year that Christopher Columbus sailed for Spain and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to arrive in the Americas, right? But also in 1492, Spain expelled their Jewish population from their borders. Like, get out of here. We don't want you here. A few years later, in 1496, Portugal did the same. But this was all a result of what we call the Spanish and the Portuguese Inquisition, where the church, the Roman church, was trying to stamp out heresy and look for people who were not Christians or not practicing Christianity. Well, of course, the Jews were their biggest focus, because they're Jews. They're not following Christianity. So the Spanish expelled their Jewish population in 1492. The Portuguese followed suit in 1496. But if you had to look a little closer, the Portuguese looked like it's not something they wanted to do, but Spain was the stronger of the two. And what happened was the original king around that time, he did not go along with that program that Spain was expelling their Jews. It was his successor who married a princess from Spain. And when he married that princess, it was those alliance marriages, So when he married the princess, one of the things in the marriage, one of the things that was contingent was, listen, if you're going to marry her, you're going to have to follow our policies of expelling your Jewish population. We're getting rid of them in our kingdom of Spain. We want you to get rid of them over there also. So the Portuguese kind of relented and just like, all right, you know what? Guess we will go along with the program. This does not mean you do not have Portuguese people who did not hate Jews, who did not like them, or whatever. But it seems like the common idea was Portugal seemed to have realized the value of the Jews in their community. But they went along with the program and they also expelled their Jews. So the Jews that stuck around, or the Jews who were able to stay within these kingdoms, they became known as crypto Jews because what they did outwardly, they pretended to be Christians. They followed the Christian rituals. They confessed and said, we're Christians. But in secret, they still lived out their Jewish identity, following their Jewish traditions and their Jewish rituals. So they became known as crypto Jews. And two areas in Portugal where these crypto Jews hung out, or communities that they started, was Belmonte and Monsanto. Okay? So another place that a lot of these expelled Jews ended up was in Madeira. And the reason why they ended up over there is because even though Madeira was a part of Portugal, Madeira was an island off the coast of Portugal. And on this new colony, Portugal were looking for people to colonize, to build up the place. So they did not mind or turn a blind eye that some of these Jews ended up over there in Madeira. It's like, yeah, you know what? We know they're there, but we're not going to really pay too much attention to them. Not to mention the fact that a lot of these Jews brought expertise with them. They were great with money. They were great with knowing how to manage certain things. So the local population there, they just blended right in. Didn't really have any issues over there with them per se. So a lot of these crypto Jews ended up, or a lot of Jews who were expelled ended up on Madeira and became part of the pioneering peoples who were there building up that colony into what Madeira is today. Or setting the foundation, I should say, for what we know as Madeira today. So all of this has just been fascinating to me. Now, was my family or my ancestry within this group? I want to say it's highly likely, because where they settled when they left Genoa and ended up over in the Iberian Peninsula was right in that area of Seville, spilling over into Portugal, into the Kingdom of Portugal, right in that very same area where Monsanto is. Now, I mentioned the name Monsanto, and yes, this is the same Monsanto from the chemical company we know today, which of course there's sometimes some controversy with them because of their GMO processing and so forth, right? But when I was growing up in St. Thomas, I remember there were families there with the last name of Monsanto. Of course, way back when, I did not even know that it was a Jewish name. But one of the things that you have to understand is that when Spain and Portugal expelled the Jews, a lot of these Jews also fled to a town in the Netherlands known as Amsterdam. Small little backward town, nothing going on. But at the same time, the Netherlands were under Spanish control. And the Netherlands were kind of like agitating for their freedom. Didn't want to be under Spanish control anymore. They wanted to get away from the Spanish. So around the same time these Jews were coming into Amsterdam, the Dutch were fighting for their independence against the Spanish. And they were like, hey, we want our independence. So the Dutch now, realizing that these Jews were bringing valuable expertise, valuable knowledge, inside information about the same place that they left from. So the Dutch were like, sure, come on in, come on in. And before you knew it, Amsterdam just boomed into this big economic powerhouse. And this little tiny area known as the Netherlands started threatening Portuguese dominance in certain places. And a lot of those Jews who were expelled, they realized that this was their opportunity to get back at Spain and Portugal. So what did the Dutch do? Before you know it, out of nowhere, they just blew up and became this trading giant. And they started more or less chasing the Portuguese around and muscling in on their operation by going to places like the colony in Brazil, which the Portuguese had colonized, but yet the Dutch showed up some years later and took over Recife, a city on the coastline there in northern Brazil. Took it over and named it New Holland. It was like, we are the Dutch, we're here, we're taking over. The Dutch also grabbed other places like what we call Suriname today, what we call Guyana today, and of course some islands in the Caribbean. And of course the Dutch went all the way over into the East Indies, over into the Pacific Ocean, and they also controlled some places over there also. So the Spanish and Portuguese loss in their Jewish population became a gain for the Dutch. So when I look back at all of these type of things, oh, and speaking of those Monsanto people, Curacao, an island in the southern Caribbean Sea, that was a Dutch island years ago. If I'm not mistaken, I don't know if they're independent right now, but Curacao has a long Dutch history. That's where the Dutch colonized. A lot of Dutch Jews who left Amsterdam and ended up in the Caribbean region ended up in places like Curacao, which was a free port. A lot of those Jews from Curacao also traveled over to St. Thomas, which at the time was under Danish control. But St. Thomas, which is where I was born, was a free port back then. And so was Curacao. And so was St. Eustatius, another island. So there was always a lot of interaction between these free ports. So a lot of Dutch Jews who had settled in Curacao would find their way up to St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies, as St. Thomas was a part of the Danish West Indies back then. It's now, of course, part of the United States or under U.S. control. So you found a lot of Jews who ended up in St. Thomas, like the Monsanto family, like the Sasso family, like the Paiwanski family, bunch of different people who eventually made it over to St. Thomas. So the Monsantos, whose name more or less came from the Monsanto region of Portugal. You know, because a lot of times, if I remember back in those days, a lot of times people named themselves, gave themselves the last names of the area they came from. Like Vasco de Gama would be like, you know, Vasco from Gama or whatever, something along that line. They would name it after their fathers or their family names, or they would name it after the location in the land where they came from. So the Monsantos apparently were crypto-Jews who left Portugal, ended up in Curacao, or ended up in Amsterdam, and I guess eventually ended up down in Curacao in the southern Caribbean, and eventually a branch of the family made it over to St. Thomas. Now, one of those Monsantos, his daughter married some man from St. Louis, Missouri back in the 1800s. That man eventually founded the Monsanto Chemical Company, naming the company after his wife's family's name, Monsanto. So I know I said a whole lot, There was a whole lot in between. But it has just been something that's really fascinating to me and something that's really interesting. Now, am I walking around practicing Jewish practices and customs and traditions? Of course I'm not. I wouldn't consider myself a practicing Jew. I'm not even going to sit here and insult anyone to say I am a Jew. I'm not going to go ahead and say that. But in my own family and many other people who may not want to admit it or who don't even know it, a lot of us are descendants. We might be descendants of Portuguese, but a lot of us don't realize that the Portuguese we're connected to were actually Jewish Portuguese. And you have to understand something else. Before the Portuguese people were there, Jews were already in Iberia long before that time. Because way back when Emperor Titus, back in AD 70, when I said AD, not AT, AD 70, when he came to Jerusalem to deal with the Jews, the rebellious Jews down there, he burnt the city down. He burnt the temple down. And when he burnt the temple down, Jews that he captured, he exiled them because the Jews were just like a thorn in the side of Rome. And he decided, you know what? Let me grab these people and exile a whole bunch of them. You know where he shipped them to? He shipped them clear across the Roman Empire to the Iberian Peninsula and Gaul, which we call France today. This was way back when. This was long before the Visigoths settled in the area that we know as the Iberian Peninsula, and the Visigoths being the forerunners of the Portuguese and Spanish people. The Visigoths came from another part of the Roman Empire also, but this was long after Jews had been exiled to the area and had been there long before the Moors showed up. So the Jews have always been an intricate part of the Iberian Peninsula, which was known as Sepharad in their language, or that's where we get the word Sephardic from. So the Jews were always there. So it's not like they just popped up somewhere here and there. Now Portugal and Spain have had, but more so Portugal has had a rather complex history when it comes to the Jews. Did they expel the Jews? Yes. Did they have moments of persecutions against the Jews? Yes. But it looks like as Portugal has looked back over their history, they realized that was a terrible miscalculation on their part. Part of it perhaps under pressure from Spain. And Spain themselves realized that that was a gross injustice. And so in the 2000s teens, I think both nations decided, you know what? Yeah, we screwed up. And we want to rectify that. And we want to try to fix that. So if you're a descendant of, and you can prove, of these crypto Jews, of these Jews, you can prove through paperwork or whatever, family history, material that you may have, that you descended from these crypto Jews, you can be granted or qualified for automatic citizenship to both of those countries. So this was just something that I found rather interesting. Now, of course, there's a whole other history I can talk about. Obviously, we do know what both of those kingdoms were a part of in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. That's a whole other topic. And I've studied all this also. It does not take away from my love and my appreciation and my respect for a place like Portugal or even Spain. I do have to understand, as a person who study history, realize it's far more complex than a lot of people may make it seem. It's not as black and white in a lot of cases as we may make it seem. And you have to really look into it to just realize just the crazy world that it was back then, to be able to understand it more in a better context and with better perspective. This is not meaning to excuse anyone for any atrocities or anything like that that took place back then. But when you look at the full picture, you sometimes get a better understanding of all the stuff that was going on. Well, that was one thing that Portugal and Spain decided they can do, and they decided to reach out to their Jewish community and try to at least do something for their posterity and try to see if they can use that as a way of just offering some measure of forgiveness for past crimes. All right? Anyway, that's my video for today. I'm sure I left out a lot, and I'm sure they're going to have people coming down in the comments and going to have things to say, which I don't mind. Just as long as you can try to be respectful, you know. And there's no rule that says you have to be. People can be very nasty. on social media. But you know, I just ask for some respect, even if you don't agree with anything I was saying. So just wanted to put that out there, okay? Anyway, you guys take care. I'm going to upload this video. It's just raw as is. There wasn't anything scripted, rehearsed, anything fancy or whatever. I'm going to upload it the minute I go ahead and do this. So I'm just uploading it directly from my phone. And I hope it came out okay. I hope my nose was clean. I hope I didn't have anything on the side of my face here. So I'm here at work. I said I was taking a break, right? So let me head back inside. And till we talk again, I see you guys again. I really appreciate you tuning in. You can share this video, you can like. I would really appreciate that, okay? So you guys take care until the next time. Here from Mad About Madeira. Take care.